Hey guys, what is the laziest chess opening that you can play? Well, let's say if you decide to play e4, e5, well, you have to be ready for a lot of different things from the Roy Lopez to the Italian game to the Scotch game. And that doesn't even include all the other options like the Danish Gambit, King's Gambit, and so many other things that you have to be ready for, Vienna. Or let's say if you play Sicilian, then you're not just having to be ready for the open Sicilian with d4, but also things like the Rosslima or Moscow with bishop b5. There's a lot of other anti-Sicilians like c3, Mora Gambit, Grand Prix attack, closed Sicilian, and you have to be ready for all of these systems when you play a mainline opening. But with a lazy option, it allows you to force your type of position on the board, and that's what we'll see in a game played recently in Bullet by the very promising Ukrainian Grandmaster Evgeny Shtembulyak, only 20 years old. And he goes for the Scandinavian here with d5. And what makes the Scandinavian a really great opening for lazy players is that after just two moves, you have a very clear structure on the board with the d pawn against the e pawn. And you also kind of know where you're going to develop your pieces from here. That you're basically going to go for the setup that black does in the game with d4. Black decides to play c6 first. You could, of course, go knight f6 if you want to give a bit more flexibility in your position. By the way, this is the move what I do recommend in my course, play the strongest Scandinavian. I've included a link in the description if you do want to check that out to really master this opening and play it in the absolute best possible way. But c6, of course, also a reasonable move order. And after knight f3, knight f6, we see that black now plays the move bishop f5. And now the move e6. And this is the setup that is definitely worth remembering here because, well, you're basically building this very solid pawn structure. We're also putting the bishop outside the pawn chain before playing e6. And it's pretty clear where we want to develop our remaining pieces as well, right? That we want to just play knight bd7. And then we're just going to develop our bishop to some square. Most likely it will be e7 or d6, but there are also some lines where you can put it on b4 as well. And most of the time you're just going to castle and have a very solid position. But times you can also castle long is the general idea, as it were. And what you might notice, by the way, is that white has played very natural developing moves, like none of his moves can necessarily be called, like, clearly, pointless, as it were. And yet, black has a very comfortable position due to white's struggles finding a good pawn break. White would love to get in a d5 break supported by c4, but right now the knight and bishop are in the way, right? The c2 pawn itself is actually under fire, potentially to a bishop takes c2, once we've got a few more pieces developed. Now, some of you might have noticed that the move d5 is possible here, with the point that after we take knight takes and bishop takes d5, that we can't take the bishop because of the pin. But this arising structure is actually very pleasant for black. White's trade off his center, and after bishop e7, well, we are now threatening to take the bishop, and if they do retreat, I mean, you have a lot of good moves, like even castling is quite reasonable. You've got it's a very solid position here. No weaknesses, you've got a central majority, all your pieces are quite well placed. Like, I'll admit, in this exact position, knight d4, and some sacks could be a little bit annoying, so you may prefer to go knight c5, just cover that and then castle, and that will avoid any of those problems. Plus, you might be able to grab the bishop pair advantage, which is always nice. Also, if you are enjoying this video so far, then definitely subscribe to the channel. After queen c7, white plays knight e5. I probably would have gone knight h4 if I was white, so the idea is that if black does take on c2, you can still try to go for d5 in a better version, using the fact that the rook's opposite the queen. So, for example, we play the same way as before, it's not quite as effective. Because, yeah, the queen is coming under attack, and white does have a pretty strong initiative with the lead in development. But also taking c2 is a bit too risky, I think. I would just go bishop g6 and get this solid position where, okay, white got the bishop pair, but the pawns on the light squares very nicely complement our remaining bishop. And you definitely can castle long and get some pretty decent counterplay down the h-file, or indeed against the d4 pawn as well. So it's a position definitely that is playable for black. Of course, the Scandinavian, it's worth pointing out that if white does play perfectly, they get an advantage out of the opening. It's the price you pay for playing a very lazy system. But even when I've played the Scandinavian against Grandmasters, very few of my opponents really had any idea how to play against it. They usually played some weaker move and I would just get a fine position out of the opening. I'm pretty confident that'll be the case as well against when your opponents play that they're not really going to know what to do against Scandinavian because they haven't faced it that often and haven't really looked at how to play against it. So black plays knight takes e5, which I I'm not sure it's a move I would have played, because I think that giving white this space advantage is quite nice. I probably would have just played a move such as bishop e7 instead, just, develop the pieces. Yeah, they can go f4 if they want to, and I mean, you'd have to be a little bit careful about g4 and f5, but okay, if you're really worried about it, you could stop it with a move like h5, but technically could even let them play it, because if they do play g4 here, you do have knight takes e5, and fe5, knight g4 does keep everything nice and safe. While if g takes f5, you again have a little tactic, knight takes c4, taking that bishop, defending knight, and only then winning the free pawn. So, as you can see, you don't have to fear g4 here. You can just, weather the storm. In the middle game, you're usually going to be playing for c5 and hitting back in the center. That'll typically give you quite good play. Like I said, if you can trade off the d pawn for the c pawn, you're just loving life here with the central majority. Black goes 95, and yeah, I'll admit that this position is a bit more comfortable for white. D5 would be a more active square for our horsey, but black goes knight d7 instead. And yeah, I think white probably needs to go g4 and try to win the bishop, but okay, in a bullet game, it's not the easiest thing to do to push the pawns in front of your king like this, especially when c2 is still on. But like I said, you don't really want to take on c2 unless you've already got a lot of pieces developed. It's better to castle the way Stembuliak did here. Also, 94, another one of these moves that is also a bit of a mistake. Actually, here you have a chance to improve on black's play, so this is a good moment for you to type in the comments below what would be the move that you would play as black in this position. And, well, when we finish the, going through the game, I'll return to this moment and see if you got it right, as it were. I'll put a little question mark just to remind myself. Okay, so we had knight b6 was played in the game. White goes bishop d3, black decides to take on e4, which it's all like typical bullet thinking, playing very forcing, like just attacking every move, swapping every move, but not really thinking about, okay, does this trade improve my position, or does it improve my opponent's position? Or, do I have an actual follow-up after my attacking move, or am I just helping my opponent play moves they want to make anyway? Like, if we apply that thinking here, like b4, yeah, it attacks the bishop, but it also kind of puts the bishop to a weaker diagonal, and we also kind of want to go for the king side, the pawn storm. On the queen side, we've got the kings on opposite flanks, we definitely want to attack faster than black. So here, this is a good example where, yeah, the attacking approach does actually prove to be good for us. Rook 81, yeah, it's a little bit slow after this, and bishop c1, we see a principle that often comes up in the Scandinavian, which is because white has a space advantage in this opening, black is going to benefit from the exchange of pieces. And so this is why bishop c1 is also a bit of a mistake, because now we're able to just swap off the rooks, and suddenly we have quite good squares for all our pieces. Like we have d5 for the knight, the queen can go down the d file. And h4 also is another one of these moves that is very, let's say, kind of thinking like it's a middle game, but we're actually getting closer to an end game. Also, if you play h5, I mean, you have fixed these pawns as weaknesses on the dark squares, which can definitely come in handy. Black decides to go queen d7 in the game, which I don't love, but I don't hate it either. The ending is still quite solid for black, even though he could definitely have extracted more from the position. Once again, with knight d5, it's worth pointing out that you don't really have to fear moves like c4 all that much. In this case, I mean, you have even a fun little trick, like where you can play bishop to e3 and, trade off into a opposite colored bishop ending that is probably drawn, but where you can, try to squeeze somehow. Or say if they do take the bishop, you can get a good knight versus bad bishop position, where the white bishop is maybe not so well placed, and knights are tricky pieces. You can set up all kinds of nice forks to definitely, well, in this case, we are even winning material a little bit with this, but after knight c4, king h2, black does decide to go bishop e3, so we do get to see the bishop versus knight situation and see that, well, white probably is pressing here. It's hard for him to really make any of an advantage due to the fact that our pawns on light squares are really killing the bishop on e4. And especially in bullet, knights are very tricky pieces, so white had missed this after knight d1. Either he's going to lose the pawn on b2, and honestly he should probably let it be lost. I mean, I think the best bet is to just sack the pawn, but at least try to get some counterplay on the king side before the black king can get there. At least it's a sharp position, where white will have some chances to save the game with this counterplay. If you play it passively the way white did with b3, it just kind of gives black what he wants, where now it's going to be a bit too slow for white to go king g4, A, because you can always bring the king over to cover it, but also because as we see the way the game plays out, the black can just go a5, b5, create a passed a pawn. And because that pawn is so far away from the white king, white's not really going to be able to stop it. Indeed, in the game, white kind of self-destructed a little bit after king a95. Maybe it's still not too late to go g4, c4 and try to open things up for the bishop, but after king h6, this was just met with knight f4. hg6, hg6 keeps your pawn safe, but after king h7, knight h5, white is just down 2 pawns for absolutely nothing, and knight can even go around just to take this pawn fixed on a dark square on e5. After king h6, knight f4, king g5, knight d5. White's down 2 pawns for absolutely nothing. Black can go after this pawn. He can queen his pawn here, so white just gave up at this stage. So a pretty convincing win for black in the end, despite, a couple of small mistakes. But okay, it's bullet. That's what often happens. Now for the puzzle in this position here. The opportunity that black had, which he didn't avail in the game, is... Well, technically there are two sort of ways to play this tactic. You could either go bishop takes e4, queen e4, knight takes e5, and discover an attack on the bishop. So in this case, black would win a pawn and have a very clear advantage. If they do play a move like queen e3, by the way, trying to get the pawn back, well, you can go rook takes c2 and you're attacking the bishop, so they don't have time to, grab the pawn, as it were. And the other way, it's just kind of similar, is to go knight takes e5 first, and after f takes bishop e4, if they do take, it is just going to transpose. In this version, there is an extra option for white, though, where they can play bishop g5 and try to win the exchange. Turns out you are still much better. Like, you can still go bishop e5, and there are some nice tactical ideas with bishop takes d8, bishop c5, king h1, and it turns out you do have bishop d6, and technically this line does still work. But it's sort of unnecessary to calculate all this when you can just go bishop e4 and then knight e5, and just avoid the whole bishop g5 possibility altogether. It's sort of a saying I like to have, that you don't want to calculate lines in chess you don't have to calculate. If you don't need to calculate the variation to find the best move in the position, then, why waste the time and energy in a sense. But anyway, that's all for this game. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in the next one.